Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight here at the Catholic Information Center. I'm Catherine Hinsman from the Thomistic Institute, and we're pleased to be sponsoring this event with the Catholic Information Center. And very honored to have our speaker, Dr. Catherine Pawluk, who is at the faculty at the Bush School and is founder of the social research academic area, where she is assistant professor of social research and economic thought. Her primary areas of research include economics of education, religion, family studies, and demographics, Catholic social thought, and political economy. Tonight, she's speaking on freedom and principles of Catholic social thought. So I'd like to welcome her up and thank her very much for joining us again. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm especially grateful for the chance to talk through some of this material. I know some of you here have heard before, so this is it's a good. But I'm pulling this kind of back out in this series on freedom, which the Thomistic Institute is running this year, which I'm really grateful for. In fact, I can't think of a time in the last decade when people have been more interested in trying to figure out what is going on with freedom and where Catholics and sort of religious conservatives more generally should sit with respect to the liberal tradition. And I can sort of leave that right there. So, and in the last 6 months or so, I'm sort of starting to pull threads together to put this into a book form. So any of your questions or thoughts would be really appreciated. Can you hear me well? Yes, you can. Okay. I am going to do my best between my glasses and this page to read. So I like to begin this set of reflections by, seem like eons ago to most of you, if it seems a long time ago. So I remembered this, the beginning of Centesimus Annus, and afterwards, actually, the National Review on Centesimus Annus, which, depending on who you read about Centesimus Annus, was or wasn't about freedom or liberty, but it depended on who you talked to. But what I wanted to remind you about was Milton Friedman's comment. Then he said, well, but except that there's a big problem, right, sort of staring us in the face in the middle of it. And he wrote this, and I'm going to quote from that National Review special supplement on Centesimus Annus. He said, I must confess, this is Milton Friedman, he said, I must confess that one, in spite of all the good things about it, one high-minded sentiment, kind of the Pope passes off in the middle of it as if it were a self-evident proposition. And he says that it sent shivers down his back. Obedience to the truth about God and man is the first condition of freedom. So whose truth, Friedman says, decided by whom? Am I hearing echoes of the Spanish Inquisition? So this is a long time ago, this comment. But I think it was a very insightful comment. So Milton Friedman, whatever you think about him, was kind of a brilliant guy. So, you're not going to he's not going to sit down with the entire corpus of Centesimus Annus and kind of miss, well, gee, right in the middle of it, we have this weird definition of freedom, which doesn't sound like anything that I think is freedom, right? So freedom defined as obedience. So it was a rather insightful pronouncement, I think, that he made. And it is, I think, so it's insightful. It is an arresting statement about liberty. So what I want to do here is sort of think a little bit harder about what it might have been that John Paul II was getting at, and ultimately sort of think through whether or not that's completely inconsistent with the cherished notions of liberty that are so has two broad things. First, in the more common usage, obedience is a characteristic of a person who follows the will of another person, or of someone or something who is submissive to the rule or authority of another. The other way we tend to use obedience is natural or involuntary laws of motion, right? And we say obey, but there's not any choice involved. We think. So this is the second way we think about obedience. Now, the first meaning, we have something in mind about persons who make voluntary choices of the will of someone else. And the second describes subjects that find themselves subject to certain kinds of laws. So here's the interesting thing, is that it seems to me, if we dig into John Paul II's idea about liberty, or about freedom, we get something human liberty being characterized by both senses of the term obedience, right? In the first sense, some kind of voluntary aligning of the will. I think John Paul certainly has something like this in mind, with laws or rules that we find ourselves involuntarily subject to. So there's certainly a bunch of things I would like to not be subject to, which I clearly am subject to. But there is certainly an element of choice. So this is really interesting. This idea about liberty, it seems to me, is predicated on a rational actor, free to make choices with free will. Another way to think about that is a responsible agent, but in addition to this kind of responsibility which comes from choice, man is also a kind of dependent creature. So in some respects, we are like the beasts, right? In some respects, we are governed by laws and rules that we don't get to make up. On those terms, then, very interesting, I mean, right, we would not be surprised to find brilliance in John Paul II. It seems to me that we have an idea about liberty which is characterized by a paradoxical paradox. The free man, so what's characterized free to rightly discern, not wrongly, to rightly discern the laws that govern us, and then to will to be subject to them. So that at least, right? I mean, clearly there's some physics involved. I can and can't do, and that is not considered particularly controversial under that category. It does seem to be controversial and profoundly unsettling to at least one of the great liberal is the idea that there are might bear some relation to what we think of as liberty. I really need a whiteboard, just kind of like layers of things. Now, I do think that someone like Milton Friedman, as a position, that there are observable and knowable laws that govern, such as, if we're talking with Milton, the laws that govern markets and states and institutions. And whether we get to the second will just be up to you. So the first question, try to unpack why exactly this Catholic idea of liberty that John Paul II put in Friedman's view on liberty, whether or not we might think about as desirable kind of natural alliance or a friendship between the Catholic tradition and the liberal tradition. This is a much more interesting question today than it was when I wrote it some years ago. I'm going to take it for granted, actually, at this moment, but perhaps not in 30 minutes. I'm going to take it for granted that thinkers in the Catholic tradition would like to align themselves with the liberal tradition. And that we can debate. And that may not be a warranted assumption, but that's where I'm going to start for tonight. And so we'll see if we get there. We can just do that in question and answers, or we can, or you can just listen. So, but the first point I can certainly get through, which is kind of why is it so unsettling? What exactly do I think the proposition is that's inherent in John Paul II? And so what I'm going to do in this first section then is kind of walk through, unpack it a little bit further, and then I am going to go right ahead and see if idea of liberty that's paradoxical involves both a willed choice, right? A willed choice, and also this dependence, a willed dependence. So when dependence, right? And again, when I say dependence, think kind of obedience, that I depend upon. This second phrasing, we could rephrase that as dependence upon. Notice in the first place that the core anthropology is taken for granted. The Catholic is kind of, I mean, some people will call it relational. We're relational beings. Both of these dependencies begin by the dependence of the child. They begin there, but they're also exemplified by, we tend to refer back to that kind of dependence. We think about that when we think about the relation we have with God. It's an analogy. It can't count. What does it even mean to think? In you I live and move and have my being. There's nothing better for that than to think about the because man is not merely a creature, but a rational creature. Each of these dependencies, dependence on God and dependence on man, involves a risk questions. The first point is that when I speak about dependence in this way, right, in you I live and move and have my being, I mean, and think about the definition of dependence, the fact of having one's existence hanging upon or fact that is somewhat beyond choice, right? So it's very interesting. If I say that I'm dependent upon my husband, right, I mean that my well-being is actions and his behaviors. In this sense, dependent is similar to use the word, right? So when we have X and Y. It's the kind of thing that we mean. It means something. It has some sort of mathematical empirical way. Doesn't mean those are the only kinds of social science. We also tend to say, you know, does Y depend upon X, right? We think about dependent and independent variables. I don't think that's sort of accidental ways to talk about the ways in which things are related. Time in social science, but not in this metaphysical way. Dependence that can't really really be avoided. So a second point that is sort of inherent in this is that if you think about dependence, now think about the language dependability, a very dependable person, right? If you haven't thought about this for a while, dependability is sort of the same thing as responsibility, or it's very similar. It's another. So a correlate of dependence for rational we will to a creature discerns a law of dependence, finds himself like a planet governed, either accepts or denies that dependence, right? So for instance, a man who discerns dependent upon God, that his existence literally hangs upon a creator, he inescapably responds. Right? And any response is a response, right? An acceptance or a denial is still a response. Or he might, in other respects, deny his maker. Likewise, a man who discerns that his infant son just does depend upon him, inescapably response. It's the wrong response, but it's a response. So he either accepts responsibility denial of the acceptance of this dependence relationship is constituted by, notice, a kind of these kinds of gifts, we think of them as care or support in the examples I've given you, they just mean that's what it is to be responsible. It's actually to observe the dependence relationship and where you're at in that dependence relationship, to make those right? These are facts. They're things I can't avoid. They're things I wouldn't want to avoid them. In fact, it's a wonderful thing to be completely and hopelessly tied into somebody else, right? Sense, right? So mothers should seek to become more responsible. Infantilizing children, we should those responsible ties. And children in their right. So these kinds of dependence relationships are not normative in addition to being factual. So now that I've kind of unpacked that, I guess the question that we should have, any sensible way, like I've just described this thing, which sounds like we're just kind of these people locked into all of these laws and there's not a lot of room for freedom in this picture. So the question is whether there's any sensible way to move from this. Been convinced yet we can do this, which I've drawn attention to something like the antecedently attractive, we'll say, norms and principles of society, right? So we have all these ideas to live in a free society. If we can't move, I'm going to say, if we can't go from this kind of dependence, which I have claimed, it's what John Paul II has in mind. If we can't get there, then he's just misusing the word. And then maybe Milton Friedman's right. Right? So there's a work that has to be done. We might think then that he's not just misusing the word, that the Catholic tradition at this point is sort of guilty of liberty. It practically doesn't mean. Liberty, we really mean locked into a big structure of things that you can't change, right? So what I'm trying to figure out if it can be done is to think about what sort of a free society would be implied by something like liberty of dependence if we take this seriously. I believe that there are at least 5, there are probably more, there are 5 doctrines that would be related to dependence that we would expect to find in such a society. So in other words, if you took responsibility and dependence seriously in the way that I just defined it, in the way that I think is pretty inherent in the tradition, there are at least 5 special doctrines. And you can think about this if it helps, because this is going to be like, well, you're doing a lot of work. If it helps you to think about like the end before I get there, what I'm going to try to do is sort of reason my way through the things that we think of as the constitutive parts of Catholic social thought and derive them from this kind of liberty that doesn't seem like liberty. And if I can do that successfully, then we can celebrate. And if not, we may just have to throw in the towel. Maybe liberalism really did fail. So the first one, okay, so 5 special doctrines we would expect to see in this kind of free society that takes liberty and dependence seriously. The first one is that one would expect to find an understanding of dependence itself as constituting, as it were, the essential goodness in society. Right, so this is already like a really big stretch. All right, so what does that mean exactly? So such a society, this is this hypothetical place, conceives of it being built up by persons who are giving and receiving in accordance with proper natural dependencies. When my little daughter, or now actually when I wrote this, now it's my little son, climbs into bed with me, usually way too early in the morning, when I accept this kind of thing, then the society that we are conceiving of will declare that her arm around my neck is actually the most valuable thing in social life, right? And it's that for the sake of which, right? That's the sort of relationship that has to be protected and defended above all, right? It's one of the most good and most close and most strong relationships of dependence. For me, for me, G.K. Chesterton's description of the girl with the golden hair in What's Wrong with the World, I think of it's one of the greatest tributes to human dignity probably ever. Read it without kind of becoming overly emotional, so maybe I should skip over this. But do you remember this passage? Should I go right ahead and read it? It's so beautiful. So G.K. Chesterton wrote that about this beautiful girl. He says he's like a beautiful little girl, 5 years old. And he says, all the kingdoms of the earth, right? That she, the human and the sacred image, all around her the social fabric shall sway and split and fall, that the pillars of society would be shaken and the roofs of all the ages come crushing down, and not one hair on her head would be harmed, right? So, now what's really interesting, I'm going to actually widen this a little bit. His vignette of this girl, so powerful. He's such a beautiful writer. It's kind of incomplete because, in fact, he references the pride of a good mother in the beauty of her daughter. And this is, so I'm going to expand now. He says, Chesterton, he says, I begin with a little girl's hair. That I know, like, right, we could debate, for instance, the status of liberalism. But what we do know is girl's hair, right? So he says, that I know at any rate is a good thing. Whatever else is evil, the pride of a good mother and the beauty of her daughter is good. It is one of those adamantine tendernesses which are the touchstones of every age and every race. And if other things are against it, then what's the it? In this case, the it is not the girl. If other things are against it, the relationship between the mother and the child, they will go down. They must go down, he says. If landlords and laws and sciences are against it, landlords and laws and sciences must go down. With the red hair of one she-urchin on the street, I will set fire to all of modern civilization. This is very powerful. So what he says there is the very it for which, not the hair by itself, but it's this relationship. Human dignity of the girl needs a kind of covering, the way the human body needs. The mother's pride. This is very interesting. So in this society, this would be the most important thing, right? That those sorts of relationships, that kind of dependence, which is so powerful, that would be the thing that we think, well, everything else, right? Everything would be ordered to that, to the protection of those kinds of relationships. The second and close corollary, the second doctrine of this fake free society that I'm imagining, is something like the priority of natural association. So in a society that is consistent with the Catholic Constitution of Liberty, as I've described it, we would expect to find a doctrine of the priority of natural associations. So the duty of the state would be to foster space for the voluntary and involuntary associations of these personal tendencies, right, in accordance with nature, right? So there's some conditions here, in accordance with nature and in relation to the common good. So private property would be defended and supported on the grounds that it is critical to the dependency of the family upon the father and mother, and that private property is necessary for the continuing extension in time of the relationship of dependence and dependability shown in biological generation. So going back to Chesterton once more, we find that he pleaded for property for the family of the girl precisely on those grounds, if we're interested in Chestertonian distributivism, but also so does Leo XIII, right, in Rerum Novarum. So ordinary markets considered as natural institutions also will generally be supported and defended on those grounds, in the sense that they are a form of free association in which people trade goods and services that increase proper dependency and responsibility, right? So we don't do the institution on its own. We do the institution in relation to this kind of proper dependency and responsibility. A society that conceives of itself along these lines would then privilege families and the formation of families. So I didn't even get off the ground before I'm bumping up against. It will not undermine responsibility that family members have to each other. Assistance to those families who supply relations like family for those who lack family, especially adoptive families, churches, and religious brothers and sisters. Critically, a free society in this sense would limit some adult freedoms for the sake of children who are dependent. But the state we are thinking of will limit limits as for the sake of freedom. Right, because the freedom was constituted by these dependence relationships. So for the sake of freedom, not against freedom. So for instance, such a state might limit marital separations, for instance, to the most extreme cases. Such as someone like Friedman or Hayek might have wanted it, but rather a kind of manifesto of social freedom in which freedom for individuals is required so that individuals can be dependent and responsible. Instead of creating immunities for individuals, right, we create immunities for individuals and those for whom and to whom he is responsible. So speaking of freedoms, the third doctrine in this society would be something like social freedom. So let us think about families and associations for a minute, as I've just described them, as dependency groups. So this is not unlike the way we think about defining the common good of an association. So they're dependency groups. So imagine that the groups in groups, the members of which are dependent upon one another to achieve a common good. A society that takes dependency seriously take dependency groups seriously, and therefore want to limit the interference of some groups into the affairs of other groups. The best analogy I can think of for this is, I'm just thinking, my children belong to a golf club, which is a public golf club in Maryland, and actually belongs to the University of Maryland. And the administrators at the University of Maryland decided recently that they needed more land. So why not take an 18-hole golf course and turn it into a 15-hole golf course? Now, that's absurd. That's actually absurd. You may as well just destroy the whole thing, right? I mean, maybe at least hack it down to 9. Right? I mean, this is like an institution of golf, and 18 means something, and 15 doesn't mean anything. But the logic is sort of similar. So if you can kind of get that logic, then the idea about dependency groups is similar. Sort of people belong to groups insofar as they're needed to achieve a common good, right? And so, you need, holes 16, 17, 18, to play the game. Like, the game hasn't been complete. So the state might want to limit the interference of some groups into the affairs of other groups. So groups have the object cannot be achieved, right? So, sports teams have a certain number of people on them. You can't have less than the number of people you need to achieve all of the positions. This would be true, right? So for this reason, at least, the kind of interference I have in mind tends to replace rich and diverse relationships of dependence, which are the dignity of individuals. Why the dignity of individuals, by the way? Because, right, not because the team needs to have a goalie, but because the goalie needs to be needed as a goalie. Right? That's why it's sort of protective of the individual, the dignity of the goalie. It's like, you need to play a role. People need to have roles to play, right? So, relationships of dependency, typically not of persons upon persons, but of persons upon institutions or bureaucracies. To limit such interference into these natural associations would be desirable, not only for the life of groups per se, but for the life of individuals who would be deprived of meaningful responsibilities. Like, there's no goalie in this group. A society which conceived of itself along these lines would therefore hold in common something like a doctrine of non-interference for special kinds of groups. Yeah, special kinds of groups, yeah, I'm begging all kinds of questions, of course. But it would set the bar for interference rather high for all naturally occurring groups, such as families, neighborhoods, churches. Certain civic groups might also qualify for a preference for non-interference, and also some firms and businesses under certain conditions. Now remember that Hayek and many of the prominent members of the liberal tradition have favored a negative definition of freedom in society as something like the state in which a man is not subject to coercion by the arbitrary will of another or of others. It's a negative definition, right? We don't want to prescribe for you everything you have to do. We just want to say you have sort of it's a negative definition of freedom. But from this we might say that the doctrine of non-interference for natural groups is a negative freedom too, but it's a negative social freedom, right? So it's not a doctrine of non-interference that applies to the individual. It applies only to the group as the unit. And at this point, if you follow me this far, we have the principle of subsidiarity now defined, right? We've gotten it. It's done. Now, the principle of subsidiarity is also best rendered in its negative version. So you may have heard the principle of subsidiarity is put something like, things ought to be done at the lowest possible level. We never really know what the lowest possible level is, right? So that's really the inferior way to talk about the principle of subsidiarity, which should be sort of like, stuff that naturally bubbles up in a good way from lower groups. So long as it's working just fine, it should be left alone. Right? But we just don't know if the lowest, when I teach my students, we don't know if what the dormitory wants is a party or a study group. Right? More formally this way, that higher order groups should not intervene into the life of lower order groups unless the lower order groups cannot fulfill their proper function, and then only with a view to restoring the lower order group to proper function. So you can derive the principle of subsidiarity in this way. So my task is just to show really that if we think about it this way, it follows that subsidiarity, perhaps you've thought about it this way before, but I hadn't. Subsidiarity is a kind of principle of social freedom. It's analogous to a conception of social justice or social charity. It's a social freedom. Why not? A society that conceives of itself as embodying this kind of liberty of dependence, therefore, or thereby, posits a strong connection between dependence and common goods through associations. Without these sort of strong dependence ties, associations would not be needed, and no common goods could be identified. With these observations, it helps to become more clear that subsidiarity itself, by the way, could not be opposed to solidarity. They're not sort of opposite things. You sometimes hear this, right? Not too much, we don't want too much subsidiarity, by which people sort of loosely mean freedom, and we don't want too much solidarity, by which I think people loosely mean like state intervention. It becomes very, very bad because it's all fuzzy. So they're not in opposition any more than freedom and charity could be in opposition, right? So subsidiarity, social freedom, is a kind of foundation, actually, for solidarity, which we understand as social charity. So love requires consistency in giving and receiving of gifts, and there is no love without freedom, and neither is there solidarity without subsidiarity. So you want to have a lot of both of them, right? And they're never in competition, right? Now there may be sort of competing policy prescriptive questions, but we would never want to say, well, we want to have a little bit of solidarity and a little bit of subsidiarity. We wouldn't want to say that, right? So finally, I've teased you a little bit about social charity. So I want to say a little bit more about social charity, and then I will wrap up, I think. We're doing our time. We're okay. So social charity, love considered in relation to dependence, has another precondition besides, namely inequality. So this one's a hard one. So I would maintain that a fourth pillar of a free society based on liberty of dependence would be a kind of doctrine or, a doctrine of the acceptance of natural difference. So we need to see inequality into this constitution of liberty is also congruent with a just conception of liberty. And one of the most fascinating sections of the Constitution of Liberty that written by Hayek, it's a very fascinating section where he's really kind of struggling with something I don't think he really works out till maybe right before he dies, or maybe he never does. It's not the last thing that he wrote, certainly. He basically just squarely rejects the idea of any sort of factual equality among human beings, which is a very odd thing for a classical liberal to reject. So kind of what is he trying to say? One of his students, Eugene Miller, who was a great interpreter of Hayek, argued that for Hayek, the relevant fact about human beings is not equality but difference. It's like, again, kind of your mind should explode a little bit if you're used to thinking about the ways in which classical liberals, for the most part, we think of them as people who are, heavy. This doctrine of inequality in Hayek didn't undermine his general case for liberty. This is a big problem for him. But I'm wondering if the right context for this is something that's really more deeply embedded in the Catholic tradition. So Hayek stumbles around an argument that is captured by the following phrase. He says, a society that does not recognize that each individual has values of his own in which he is entitled to follow, can have no respect for the dignity of the individual and can't really know freedom, which is a very odd thing to say. I think that Hayek has sort of hit on a notion of dependence, perhaps. What I think he wants to say is that difference or inequality, of course, he thinks of it as something that has to arise from sort of individual preferences. We protect individual preferences at all costs, right? These are very important. And those individual preferences may lead us, in fact, to make choices which develop various gifts and talents, and not all of us will make $1 million because some of us will like to read books for a living. He thinks of these innate differences as things which then bloom into different choices. So we have this different society full of all kinds of differences, and of course, he's working against some kind of misplaced egalitarianism. But I think that, so in this context, I really like to refer back to this idea that is really deeply embedded in the dialogue of St. Catherine, which is that factual, like observable, factual, material, and spiritual inequalities actually form the basis for dependence. It's how we even think about dependence in the first place. And here's this passage, it's brief. She writes, of course, of God the Father, all of these gifts, and specifically material and temporal gifts, I have given, and I, the God the Father, have given indifferently, it's sort of just, they're out there, and I have not placed them all. And then actually, as if it needed elaboration, Catherine elaborates, I could easily have created men possessed of everything that they needed for both body and soul, but I wish that one should have need of the other. People should have need of each other, and that they should be my ministers to administer graces and gifts that they've received from me. It's this nice phrase, which I really like to quote. At the very end of this passage, Catherine, God the Father, says, whether men will or whether they won't, they can't help making. And it's a funny statement because then she goes on to clarify, well, if there isn't any real love for God involved in these sorts of gifts and exchanges between, there's no merit, like there's no grace is obtained in this, but still it's kind of, it's the act of an act, like you're making the gift, like you need stuff from your neighbor and they need stuff from you. So you're going to do this, and it's better if you do it for love of God. But even if you won't, so whether you will or no, you're going to have to do this. You're going to have to give stuff to each other. So this is very interesting, and I don't think Hayek never gets there. He certainly doesn't get there, but I think he's stumbling around this a little bit. So, of course, Plato did observe that the market arises as a kind of natural institution because of the differences in natural inclination and talent, which lead, of course, to specialization and division of labor. This doesn't, begin with Adam Smith. So the market is the means by which specific talents of each naturally and without coercion contribute to the greater flourishing of the whole. So a member of a society of equals, of course, would either devote himself to self-subsistence or would regard social cooperation as just contrived, right? We have no reason to cooperate. The giving and receiving that takes place in dependency relations is what we call love. So furthermore, this mutual exchange of gifts also is binding, and this is the most important part about the principle of charity. To dive into those writings of the Pope, right, is it's not just that we do things for each other, but that actually this binds us together, because Pope Leo quotes Plato and says, well, as everybody knows, the unity of the state is the highest thing. So the unity in the state is the highest thing. It's the thing we all aim at. So in fact, if we're going to get to unity, we have to do things which bind us to each other. And so this is what's so good about inequality. So this is really like, who's going to am I on tape? Who is going to get up and say that, inequality is a really great thing to have? But actually, this is really baked into this tradition. It's really there. So for Catholic thought, I think the move from difference and inequality to solidarity, which is a virtue, is almost reflexive. I think it's deep and it's back there. But I don't know of any systematic attempt to explore the importance of inequality rooted in dependence, right, as a kind of precondition for the free society. One must take care, of course, that in emphasizing the value of dependence or difference or inequality, one fosters no complacency about unjust inequalities. Yet for all the concern over inequality, and now I'm thinking about, social policy over the last 75 years, there has been relatively little concern for the opposite danger, which is that egalitarian social policies to opportunity. So summed up then, the society that conceives of itself in accordance with this kind of liberty would also regard inequality in nature to be a kind of gift that gives rise to social glue, which leads to unity. So could we maybe find the kernel of the reason why our contemporary social commentators are trying to convince us that we are now facing the greatest class divisions ever experienced in the United States after half a century of policies aimed at the equalization of outcomes? It would be interesting to think that that was just a coincidence, right? So I'm going to complete this argument now by just a final religious freedom, and I will be done. So on religious freedom, I said there were at least 5 doctrines. These are the ones that I have so far, but I think they correspond fairly well. So the 5th doctrine is something like a doctrine of religious freedom. So persons dependent on God can practice real willed dependence on God only if they choose to obey the law of dependence that they find themselves subject to, and thus choosing, which is obedience in the first sense, this choosing demands a lack of coercion in religion. And this is what all of the wise minds on freedom of religion have told us. Now, it would be difficult to go much further in this point without, in this context, making reference to dignitatis humanae as a kind of articulation of the ideals and the norms we would expect to find in a society taking this kind of liberty of dependence seriously. Note here, however, that dignitatis humanae makes heavy use of the language of rights and duties. But I find the language of dependence and obedience easier for grounding the right to religious freedom, right? Reality, of course, is the same. In fact, rights and duties correspond fairly well. If you have been imagining that's where I was going, they correlate fairly well with the language of rights and duties. But I will not be the first to question, certainly, whether the language of rights has done the work for us that we hoped it would do for us. Possibly, I don't know if I'm the first to say it, I'm probably not the first to say it, that there is probably no more mischievous area for the language of rights than in the area of religious freedom. So to give an example, I might say, for instance, that I have argued in other contexts that emphasizing the right to religious freedom in the political battle over, say, the HHS mandate might in fact doom the cause from the beginning. The reason is that every true right has to be based on some underlying fact in the order of things. And whatever they may say, everyone perceives this, just as they perceive and ultimately hold that an unjust law is no law. Very few people will be loyal to a procedural conception of justice if they do not see how it preserves in us and in society what they regard as substantive justice. So if we can't make the case, right, grounded on the substantive order of things, that man just is dependent on God, this is why we have to have religious freedom, not merely because everybody just has sort of like a right from the middle of nowhere to worship as they see fit. I might possibly then be participating unwittingly in speculation is our biggest enemy. For this reason, I can think of probably no more dangerous area than to use this kind of ungrounded rights language than in religious freedom. So practically speaking, then on the policy arena, the society that we are imagining would privilege churches and school communities and the natural rights of parents to teach religion to their children. All schools would, I'll say that again, all schools would be religious schools, and prayer would be taken seriously as an essential part of civic life. Though we have seen, I'm about done, so I'm going to go right ahead and say this. I always ask my students why it was such a big problem for the Soviets to come through and take all the crosses out of Poland. And they always say the same thing. They always say because they have a right to have their crosses up. But that's not the right answer. I mean, if we're deeply embedded in the Catholic tradition, the reason it's a bad thing is because Jesus Christ should be in the public square, right? I mean, that seriously is an essential part of civic life. So we've seen small divergences here, I think, in the conception of liberty with that of the classical liberals. But here, I think, on this point, is a fairly serious divergence. So the fatal conceit of classical liberalism, to borrow another phrase from Hayek, seems to be a kind of undue optimism in the power of the free society to move toward order and efficiency and progress on its own and on the basis of some sort of freestanding impetus. It is true that these important social goods cannot be attained by government planning. On that point, I'm in no disagreement. But it's also true that they cannot be achieved without real dependence on God, the latter taking the form of widespread spiritual virtue, an actual attachment, right? This is a dependence relationship that has to be protected, actual attachment, direct or indirect, to the Holy Mother Church. And on this point, having Catholics and Protestants debate these things constantly is not very, very helpful. Orestes Bronson is probably better on that point than almost anyone I can think of, right? It's not enough, actually, if we're thinking about detachment or attachment to the church. It's not enough to sort of be mere Christians, mere Christianity sense of the word. Right. And so certainly the popes who developed the beginning of the tradition of Catholic social thought, they thought it was pretty important to mention. In fact, if you really want to read it carefully, the vast majority of Rerum Novarum is devoted to the principle that, yes, sure, it's fine, we got to reject socialism, that's the wrong answer. But now let's think about where we're going to find the solution to class division in society. Well, this is where the church comes in. So the Pope is sort of triumphalist. He says, well, nobody else has got anything going for them, but the church actually can solve these things. Why? Because we have grace. This is very interesting that we are all mostly wanting to do this project of thinking about Catholic social thought as it relates to democracy and so on, without taking just as seriously the fact that there needs to be grace. So we've been forced into a funny position where we're kind of doing battle for some of the right things, I think, but in a functionally Pelagian way, and that's tough. So I'm going to stop there. That's quite enough. And we can have a discussion if there's more time.
We do have time to take a couple questions. I just ask that you raise your hand. Yeah. Go ahead. And we'll make sure that our viewers at home can hear as well as for our audience.
Yeah. Hi, good evening. I came here thinking that I would hear it'd be a dry discussion on Chapter 4's treatise of labor and how it's tied to Rerum Novarum, but rather we had a rather engaging graduate level seminar on societal organization. So thank you very much.
I don't know if I should apologize or say you're welcome.
I like your notion that relationship is so important, and it occurred to me when I was thinking as you were talking about if you have a small business, I mean, there's no motivation to be either of those, right? I mean, because it doesn't matter.
Right.
And so I realize how important those free relationships are of giving and taking instead of being forced to give something.
Yeah.
Anyway, just an observation based on some of what you said.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
A lot of questions on this side. You got to step it up.
Hi. On the question of freedom of dependency, I started thinking about just from the beginning the creation story where God sees man.
Yeah.
He says it's not good for man to be alone.
Yeah.
And he creates man and woman in his image and likeness.
Yeah.
And just from the beginning, you can see that the power of relationship and dependency for flourishing of societies. And I was thinking also that, with the teachings of St. John Paul II on Centesimus Annus and where you can see places civil society institutions are the places that are more propense to fall into like the opioid crisis or unemployment or that kind of things. And I do think that that's really what the whole message is that the church is trying to convey. If I may, in another point, answering or maybe getting some insight into the question about Milton Friedman, why he was so critical of the encyclical, what he didn't understand. I would like to say that, maybe because his economics are so positive, and so experimental, where you can control certain variables and whatnot. He did not understand the humane side of the economics of St. John Paul II. But I would like to argue that the Austrian tradition of Hayek is entirely compatible with the teachings of St. John Paul II. I mean, St. John Paul II's critique of socialism it's almost like if we would take it from Mises' book on socialism.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that there's some really interesting differences between economists of the 20th century, the ones that all identify themselves. I mean, in that sense, yeah, you're absolutely right. Friedman is a very different guy than Hayek is. I do think Hayek gets closer and closer to this, close to the end of his life. And I've never read it in a piece. I'm told that Hayek converted before he died, but I don't know if anyone else could confirm. I mean, that's not, and I don't say that to say that I agree with everything that man ever wrote, but there's something in there. Now, for sure, a younger Hayek would have disagreed with the proposition that sort of religious freedom is, valuable because we need grace, right? That actually the thing that he conceives of as possible takes for granted that individuals can function they can function with the amount of sin that they have to deal with, right? So he doesn't really get into that, and I think he would have disagreed with that, right? But I think that your point about Friedman is correct. At least I agree with that, yeah.
We have time for 2 more remarks or questions.
Thank you for your talk. My question derives from another G.K. Chesterton quote. So he says, at some point, and I don't think it's in Orthodoxy, I couldn't remember where it is, but he says the freedom that he cares the most about is the freedom to bind himself. And I'm curious though, because in looking at the Soviet Union, there's a lot of ways in which citizens are bound, but it's not the ways that are chosen, and it's also not the natural way. So I'm curious if you could talk about, and that the idea that came to mind is kind of a competition for our dependence, the different artificial ways of being bound, and then choosing a natural way of being bound.
Yeah. So this is a very difficult question, and it's a good question, which is kind of, how do you start to figure out which dependencies are good ones and which ones are not good ones, right? So like all dependence is not good, and I've used the term natural a lot, right? And it's clear that I'm pulling natural out of someplace, right? Someplace. So I would not think that we could attempt to do this project, right, entirely without both the Catholic intellectual tradition. But specifically, what do I mean, right? I mean sort of the scholastic tradition of natural law, but also, right, one of the things that's most interesting about economic thought in particular, it seems to me, is that a great many actual discoveries are made in economic thought, right? I mean, so it's not like we always knew these things. We certainly knew some things about markets, but there's a bunch of things we discover in time. But we discovered them at a certain point in time, right when scientists thought their big job was to sort of explicate everything without reference to God and revelation, right? So Smith arrives sort of in the heyday of British natural theology, which is in part what makes him sort of such an interesting character. Now, clearly, I mean, I can't think of too many. I mean, unless you want to pick out someone like David Hume, who's sort of, what is he up to? I mean, he's really up to sort of trying to really overthrow a bunch of things that we all took for granted. Smith is not, or at least he doesn't think that he is, right? He gets accused of that by some people, but he's not. That's not really what he's interested in doing. But he arrives at a time, and which is, in fact, I think why he distances himself. I mean, he was a good friend of Hume, but he distances himself pretty sincerely from Hume's thoughts on religion. So I don't think Smith is up to that. I mean, I think there's this kind of circle of folks at this time, in this sort of this Enlightenment period, that, project of natural theology is a good one. The problem is that we needed all of those insights in relation to economic thought. I mean, it's not as if they just were reinventing stuff. There were new things that were discovered, but actually those new things were then never integrated into an older Christian and classical tradition in the way that earlier discoveries were. And I don't think that's been done. It's probably, I mean, maybe it can't be done, maybe it can be done in part, But I think that that's one of the things that's in there. That's kind of a weird digression from what you said, which had to do with kind of discerning which are the good and the bad dependencies and which ones. And I think that's a project that needs to be done. Now, the cheap way I can answer your question is to say what I would be fine with putting a bunch of them off the table and saying we're just going to settle this one. You can get a couple of them straight. So, for example, right, to your point about civil society. The first unit of civil society is the marriage, right? The marriage and the family. We don't have that one straight. We could just get that. We could just have a good, honest discussion about divorce law. I'd be really quite happy with that. And I think we could make some progress on divorce law. We would kind of push the ball forward on a lot of the other unnatural dependencies that I think we're worried about. That's the cheap way to answer it, which is just, okay, let's suppose there's a bunch of things we're clear. Like, we're clear it's worth protecting the dependence that children have on their two biological parents, so far as that's possible. We're clear. We're going to put everything in that basket, and then we're not clear about some of these other ones. Well, let's just do the one we're clear on, and probably a bunch of other things are downstream from that. So that's the cheap way of answering the question.
I'm going to take one more question on this side.
Yes, I like the idea of putting the faith
Yeah.
at the center of the development of faith. Dependency on God comes through prayer life. So,
Yes.
just drawing on my own experience, in
Yeah.
1968, the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth emphasized prayer, the rosary, and then the application in the schoolyard of two boys who would fight was, and this was taught in the classroom, that
Yeah.
you must apologize, you must never hate anyone,
Yeah.
you may dislike what they do.
Right.
But I perceived and experienced by the late 1970s, still in Catholic schools, a decoupling of the application of social doctrine from a prayer life, often recurring to secular social science descriptions of problems in society that needed to be remedied through government programs. No one told us between 1977 and 81, when I was in a Catholic high school in the Northeast, to not pray the rosary. They just never told us to.
Yeah.
And even in religion classes, it was often there's this sort of secular approach.
Yeah.
And well, I think you get the point.
Yeah.
So that prayer life, that interior life, obviously needs an application in society. But I don't know if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I could a little bit. I mean, I think I'm fond of highlighting. So there are a lot of reasons to love John Paul II, and the fact that we're sitting in the month of October and his feast day is coming up is a good reason to talk about him. But I'm fond of highlighting the fact that we think about when he went to Poland and visited Poland after he became Pope. It's true that he had in mind, he seems to have had in mind the plight of the Polish people, right? I mean, so this is among the kinds of things you're mentioning, certainly a social problem, right? It's a big social problem. But what does he do is he really goes and he tries to pray with people. And in fact, the most powerful times that he spent with the Polish people in Poland were leading them in prayer. And it was a little bit, people say, well, it's a little bit subversive because, of course, he's praying with people. And people want to sort of unpack that as a purely, as a rational process, as a thing that, not that it isn't a rational process, but they want to unpack it as, well, aha, he was getting his ideas in there. So even, religious conservatives do this all the time. So they're like, well, he's stirring up in the people a kind of identity of who they are. And who they are as Poles, they're Christians. And of course, he says this in that Warsaw Victory Square speech. He says, well, you're Christians. But it's not that what he's doing is just sort of getting ideas in there subversively, right? He is praying with them, and that's what he does first and foremost. So, you could do this reading of that trip to Poland as if, like, grace didn't matter, and the fact that he went and prayed didn't matter. That's not what he said. Right? I mean, he's calling them to, but then he says, but now I'm going to stand with you, I'm going to pray with you on this ground. I would really favor, in general, a reading of that kind of witness as showing us by example we should, ideas always matter. Ideas really definitely do matter, but prayer matters an awful lot. And I think that we do instinctively know that, but we do forget. And, certainly not for wrong reasons, religious conservatives, Catholic conservatives in this country have spent an awful lot of time talking about ideas. Probably our Christian pluralism has made that necessary, right? So Christians in this country don't all share. Christians, I mean, you can get only so far, but then at a certain point, we're not going to be able to talk in a coherent way about grace. But I do think this is one of the reasons why Martin Luther King Jr. still remains such a powerful figure. It's not that his life was perfect. It's not that, but he kind of said, well, we're not going to do this without praying. So I'm going to get out there and we're going to pray. And I think that people understand that that's actually kind of how this is supposed to work. So that's my comment. It's just a short comment. But what you raise is, I think, a really serious indictment against the way in which many religious people in this country and abroad have thought the exercise of Catholic social thought, so to speak, is supposed to work. As a kind of like a better set of ideas, right? So it is a better set of ideas, but that's not all that it is. And if you strip it of the grace, it's just like declaw it. Right? Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you all again so much for coming out and listening to Catherine's insight. It's always so great to have her here to speak at the CIC. I know her husband spoke here earlier this year, so if you're interested in that conversation, and you can find it on our website. Again, I just want to say it's a joy to co-sponsor and partner up with the Thomistic Institute. They're putting out great events, as are we. Visit both of our websites so you can stay up to date on all of our upcoming events, and visit our new CIC website. I'm really excited about that. We just launched it, so explore it, see all the resources that it has to offer you, and I invite you to stay for our reception that will go until 8 p.m. sharp, and thank you again so much for coming.
Thank you.